The Wilcox Portfolio. The malady stole upon Henry Anthony Wilcox not with the abruptness of a fever, but with the insidious crawl of an unbidden thought, a subtle loosening of the bonds that held his delicate sensibility to the anchors of mundane reality. It was a bleak December, and the slate-grey waters of Narragansett Bay churned beneath skies perpetually overcast, mirroring the growing turmoil within him. A student of sculpture, barely into his 20s, Wilcox was already a familiar figure in the artistic circles of Providence, not for robust talent, perhaps, but for a singular, almost painful sensitivity, a neurasthenic disposition that rendered him a tuning fork for the city's subtlest vibrations, both aesthetic and disquieting. This new affliction, however, resonated with frequencies entirely alien. It began as a persistent low-grade fever, a constant throb behind his eyes that no amount of rest or camphor could alleviate. It was a prelude, he would come to realize, to the unraveling of his world. It began with the dreams. At first they were mere impressions, fragments that dissolved like smoke upon waking, leaving only an indelible residue of profound, unreasoning dread. He saw impossible architectures, colossal structures of black, greasy stone that defied terrestrial physics, reaching towards a sky that was not blue, but a sickly, phosphorescent green. Shapes shifted within these cyclopean ruins, amorphous masses that hinted at impossible anatomies, limbs that writhed independently, eyes that gleamed with predatory light. Sounds, too, assaulted him, a guttural chanting, rhythmic and maddening, a chorus of voices that were neither animal nor human, but something primordial and utterly blasphemous. These were the raw, terrifying colours and forms, the discordant symphonies of an existence utterly alien. As the days blurred into an indistinguishable cycle of waking lassitude and nightmarish slumber, the visions grew sharper, more insistent. Each descent into sleep was a forced voyage into a realm of encroaching madness. The geometries of the dream cities resolved into colossal blocks of basalt and an unknown ichor-coated stone, polished by eons of unimaginable forces. He saw vistas of cosmic oceans, not of water, but of a viscous green-black fluid stretching to horizons where distant starless constellations burned with an inner terrible fire. And within these abyssal depths he glimpsed them colossal, tentacled forms, ancient beyond reckoning, stirring in an abyssal slumber. The chant, once a distant echo, now throbbed in his very skull, a pulse of malevolent life that threatened to shatter his sanity. Funglui mgluanaf Cthulhu While Wagahnagl Ftagn. The words, though unknown, seared themselves into his subconscious. Upon waking, drenched in a cold sweat that clung to his thin nightshirt, his first desperate impulse was always to translate the horror. He would seize charcoal and paper, his hands trembling with a feverish urgency, attempting to pin down the unpin-downable. But the two-dimensional flatness of the page was an insult to the terrifying three-dimensionality of his nightmares. The lines were too crude, the shades too shallow, the perspective too human. The true horror lay not in the forms themselves, but in their inherent wrongness, their defiance of all natural law, a profound disjunction that could not be conveyed by mere representation. It was as if he were trying to capture the taste of an alien star with earthly pigments. Then came the clay. It was a grey, desolate afternoon, a fortnight into his torment, when Wilcox found himself standing before a fresh, cool block of moist sculptor's earth. He had not consciously sought it out. His hands, pallid and elongated, simply moved, guided by an imperative he couldn't name, a dreadful, insatiable hunger that transcended his artistic will. His fingers, usually so delicate in their rendering of the human form, now worked with a frantic, almost violent energy. The boundaries between waking and dreaming had begun to blur. He heard the faint echoes of the chanting in the mournful cry of the winter wind. Fleeting shadows, not of his gaslight or furniture, but of more ancient, more terrible things, flickered at the periphery of his vision. He felt the weight of unimaginable abyssal pressures, the bone-deep cold of cosmic voids, even as he sat in the familiar cluttered comfort of his Thomas Street studio, a space now permeated by an unnatural chill. The bas-relief took shape with terrifying, dreamlike speed. It was not a conventional sculpture, not an academic exercise in technique or form. It was a raw, visceral outpouring of the nightmares that had colonized his mind. Strange, angular, hieroglyphic characters, unlike any known to man, flowed from his fingertips, etched with furious precision into the yielding clay. Squamous tentacles, bulbous, multifaceted eyes, and forms that were vaguely humanoid, yet monstrously alien, emerged from the grey earth. He moulded undulating masses, suggestive of ancient slime-coated stone, of petrified ichor and solidified blasphemy. And at the very heart of the composition, a vast, malformed head, its features a chaotic maelstrom of cephalopod and dragon, its brow ridged, its jawless maw gaping. It was the face of his most persistent, most tormenting nightmare, the great slumbering entity that had invaded his subconscious, whose name, Cthulhu, he still did not consciously know, yet whose image was burned into his very soul. As he worked, a new, unnerving dimension began to manifest within the confines of his studio. A pervasive chill, deeper and more penetrating than any winter draught, settled in the air, seeming to emanate from the very walls. The gaslight, when he lit it each evening, would flicker erratically, its yellow flame dancing with an unnatural vigour, casting grotesque, elongated shadows that seemed to mimic the writhing forms of his dreams upon the studio walls. He would hear whispers, faint and sibilant, just beyond the threshold of hearing, like the rustle of vast unseen wings in an airless void, or the ponderous slither of something immense and glistening across wet, black stone. He dismissed them as the products of his fevered imagination, the symptoms of his neurasthenia, yet their persistence, their insidious growth, gnawed at the frayed edges of his composure. He found himself pausing, chisel in hand, turning his head sharply, expecting to catch a glimpse of what? One particularly harrowing night, fully absorbed in the fevered act of creation, Wilcox felt a distinct and terrifying pressure in the room. It was not physical in the sense of a tangible weight, but a psychic burden, a pervasive, suffocating sense of being observed by a multitude of unseen, unblinking eyes. The air grew thick, humid, almost unbreathable despite the piercing cold outside. He looked up, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and saw nothing but the familiar disarray of his tools, his smocks, his half-finished studies. Yet the feeling persisted, growing as if the very space around him was warping, stretching, becoming porous, thinning like ancient parchment. He returned to the clay, his fingers now moving almost autonomously, shaping a particularly intricate and revolting detail, a series of alien runes, sharply angled and impossibly ancient, that seemed to writhe and undulate even in the inert clay. As he finished etching the last character, the gaslight above him flared violently, spitting a shower of sparks, then died with a faint pop, plunging the studio into absolute, suffocating darkness. Wilcox gasped, a choked cry escaping his lips, a sound swallowed by the sudden void. He fumbled desperately for matches, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the box, scattering its contents across the cold floor. From the profound darkness, a sound emerged, distinct and horrifying. It was a wet, sucking sound, incredibly loud in the silence, as if something impossibly heavy and viscous was being peeled from a sticky surface. It seemed to come directly from the direction of his bas-relief. Then a low, guttural murmur, an intonation that was not quite a growl, not quite a voice, but something far more ancient and terrible, a resonance from the depths of time. It vibrated deep within his bones, bypassing his ears and striking directly at the core of his being, a chord of cosmic dread. He scrambled on his hands and knees, his mind screaming in panic denial, convinced his sanity was finally fracturing. His trembling fingers closed around the matchbox, and with a desperate, superhuman effort, he managed to strike a match. The small, fragile flame leaped to life, its weak, yellow glow illuminating the studio in a terrifying, flickering dance. He cast the light towards the bas-relief. It stood there, seemingly unchanged, the clay still moist and pliable, the monstrous forms locked in their sculpted agony. But something was different. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from parched pavement, but cold, intensely, impossibly cold, causing the hair on his arms to prickle. And the whispers. They were louder now. A cacophony of alien voices, chittering and droning, just on the other side of perception, a chorus of malign anticipation. He could feel the proximity, the immense, unspeakable otherness pressing against the fragile membrane of his reality, seeking passage. Sleep became an even more terrifying ordeal, a forced journey into the very heart of the abyss. The dreams were no longer abstract or fragmentary. He was there, truly present, in the Cyclopean cities, beneath the crushing weight of alien skies, amidst the gibbering throngs of Shoggoths and other nameless horrors. He stood before altars of unimaginable dimensions, witnessing blasphemous rituals performed by entities that flowed and pulsated like noxious miasma, their forms shifting, their voices chanting in unison with the rhythmic thrumming he now heard even in his waking hours. And always the colossal slumbering titan, its vast green oily form stirring in dreams far older than mankind. He understood, with a clarity that threatened to shatter his very consciousness, that these were not mere dreams. They were memories, ancient and terrible, seeping into his mind not of his own past, but of a cosmic past, a primal reality that predated all life on Earth. He began to perceive the dream entities now, not just as grotesque forms, but as individuals, albeit individuals of a terrifyingly alien sort. Vast winged horrors, their leathery membranes catching the faint, unholy light, slender, many-jointed beings that scuttled on untold legs, things that resembled pulsating blobs with myriad, malevolent eyes. They moved through the Cyclopean city of Rilaer, performing unspeakable rites, always with an eager, anticipatory air. And their focus, he slowly, horrifyingly realized, was often directed not at him, the dreaming observer, but beyond him, towards a distant, shimmering gateway. A doorway. The realization struck him like a physical blow one dawn as he awoke, gasping for air, the taste of brine and ancient decay on his tongue. The bas-relief, his art. It wasn't merely a representation of his nightmares, it was a conduit, a bridge. His fevered mind, coupled with his acute artistic sensitivity, had inadvertently opened a channel, a psychic wound, in the fabric of reality. The entities in his dreams were not just performing rituals, they were performing summoning. And they were summoning themselves to cross through the doorway he was so diligently, so compulsively sculpting. A new, colder kind of terror took root in Wilcox's heart, a calculating horror that transcended mere fear of the unknown. He wasn't just a witness, he was a participant, an unwitting accomplice in the potential undoing of his world, a cosmic doorkeeper. The implications of this revelation were staggering, threatening to eclipse his already fading sanity. He tried to stop working. He picked up his sculpting tools, the familiar weight of them suddenly alien in his grasp, determined to smash the monstrous thing, to utterly destroy the burgeoning portal. But his hands wouldn't obey. A force, subtle yet irresistible, compelled him back to the clay. It was as if the bas-relief itself exerted a magnetic pull, a dreadful, insatiable hunger for completion, for its own hideous manifestation. His fingers, now impossibly thin and bony from lack of sleep and nourishment, trembled as they continued to refine the hideous forms, adding yet another layer of ancient grime and alien texture, a new, more profound depth to the horror he had wrought. He felt like a marionette, his strings pulled by unseen puppeteers from an unimaginable dimension, his will utterly subsumed. The manifestations in the studio grew bolder, more aggressive. Shadowy forms writhed at the very edges of his vision, coalescing for a moment into something vaguely resembling the winged nightmares from R'lyeh, only to dissipate into the flickering gaslight, leaving behind a faint, acrid scent like ozone and decay. The whispers became distinct, albeit utterly incomprehensible, a chorus of guttural clicks and sibilant, slithering tones that seemed to emanate directly from the heart of the bas-relief, a communication from another place. The cold intensified to an unbearable degree, so much so that he could see his breath in the air, a visible mist in his own living room, as if the very warmth of life was being drawn out of the space. One evening, as the winter storm outside howled with a mournful, animalistic fury, beating against his window panes like a frantic, desperate hand, Wilcox heard a new sound. It was a rhythmic thrumming, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards, through the very foundations of the building, like a vast, unseen engine operating beneath the earth. The studio trembled subtly, an almost imperceptible vibration that nonetheless filled him with unspeakable dread. He stood before the bas-relief, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the cosmic thrum. The clay sculpture itself seemed to pulse with a faint greenish luminescence, a sickly, unearthly glow that eerily illuminated the grotesque forms he had carved. The surface of the bas-relief began to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen force, its rigid forms momentarily dissolving into fluid movement. A low moan escaped Wilcox's lips. This wasn't just psychic pressure or auditory hallucination. It was a physical alteration, a violation of the very matter of his world. The hieroglyphs etched into the clay seemed to deepen, to take on a terrifying three-dimensional quality. as if they were sinking into the surface, becoming not just symbols, but gateways in themselves. A faint, cloying odour, like stagnant water mixed with something metallic and unwholesome, filled the air, thick and nauseating. He stared, transfixed by a horror that transcended anything he had yet experienced, as the ripples on the bas-relief intensified, becoming violent undulations. From the very centre, where the monstrous head of Cthulhu was depicted, the clay began to stretch, to pull inwards, forming a shallow, concave depression. And from that depression, slowly, agonizingly, with a wet, sucking sound that made his stomach lurch, a single, elongated, greenish-black tendril thick as his arm pushed forth into the air of his studio. It was not a hallucination. It was undeniably real. Wilcox stumbled backwards, falling over his stool, a choked scream caught in his throat. The tendril, slimy and glistening with an unearthly moisture, quivered as it emerged, stretching slowly, deliberately, into the mundane air of his apartment. It pulsed, retracting and extending, contracting and expanding, as if testing the atmosphere, tasting the reality it had so blasphemously breached. Its surface was covered in suckers that seemed to flex and contract with a life of their own, and from its tip, a single large unblinking eye, multifaceted and glowing with an inner malevolent green light, slowly opened and fixed itself upon him with an intelligence that was ancient and utterly malign. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over Wilcox, so profound it threatened to stop his heart, to obliterate his consciousness entirely. This was it. The crossing. The dreams had been a prelude, his art the unwitting key, his very being a sacrificial offering. The entity from Orlaer, or at least a hideous part of it, was attempting to manifest through his sculpture. The chittering voices from the bas-relief swelled to an unbearable roar, a cacophony of alien delight and triumph, a sound of cosmic triumphant hunger. The studio spun around him, the walls seeming to melt into indistinct blurs, the floor to undulate beneath him like a living thing. He saw glimpses of the dream world behind the emerging tendril, not just on the bas-relief, but through it. The black cyclopean stones, the green miasmic air, the endless churning ocean beyond all were visible, pressing against his fragile reality, a terrifying glimpse of the true cosmos. The air grew impossibly cold, then suffocatingly hot, as if two incompatible realities were struggling to occupy the same finite space, tearing at the fabric of his existence. The tendril extended further, swaying drunkenly, its multifaceted eye still fixed on him with a terrible, penetrating gaze. It was a probe, a scout, a monstrous finger testing the waters, preparing the way for the greater horror that lay beyond. Wilcox felt an immense, crushing pressure in his head, as if his skull was about to burst from the sheer force of alien thought. He could feel the thoughts of the entity, vast and ancient and utterly inimical to life, trying to worm their way into his mind, to consume him, to utterly obliterate him, to drive him hopelessly, irrevocably mad. With a desperate primal instinct, a final, flickering spark of human will, Wilcox pushed himself up, scrambling for something, anything to ward it off. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, fell on a heavy mallet, a tool typically used for the rough shaping of large clay forms. He seized it, his muscles screaming in protest, his sinews burning. The mallet felt impossibly heavy in his trembling hands, yet a spark of defiance, a flicker of humanity's stubborn, self-preservative will, ignited within his ravaged soul. He lunged forward, not at the tendril itself, but at the bas-relief, the very source of the abomination. With a guttural cry that was more sob than shout, more despair than courage, he brought the mallet down with all his remaining strength, aiming for the heart of the monstrous face, the focal point of the emerging horror, the blasphemous eye he had sculpted. The blow landed with a sickening crunch. The clay exploded outwards, sending shards flying across the studio, revealing the skeletal wooden armature beneath, twisting metal wires like shattered bones. The tendril, as if severed from its unseen source, writhed violently, retracting with horrifying speed back into the shattered remnants of the bas-relief, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The sickly green glow flickered, then died, plunging the sculpture back into inert grey earth. The chittering chorus of voices shrieked, a sound of frustrated rage and receding power, then faded into a profound, suffocating silence. The sudden cessation of the otherworldly assault left Wilcox gasping, his body trembling uncontrollably, his mind reeling in the void left by the retreating horror. The oppressive alien pressure in the room vanished, replaced by the familiar, albeit still cold, air of his studio. The gaslight, which he hadn't even noticed, had flickered back on during his desperate act, now cast a steady, albeit dim, illumination, a weak bastion against the encroaching darkness. He stood amidst the wreckage of his art, his chest heaving, the mallet still clutched in his hand, its weight a phantom against his skin. The bas-relief was utterly ruined, smashed into a chaotic mess of broken clay and twisted wire, an archaeological site of impossible horror. No tendril remained, no alien eye gazed at him. Only the damp, earthy smell of the shattered clay filled the air, mingled with the faint, lingering scent of ozone, and something far older, far fouler. He had stopped it, or had he merely delayed the inevitable? Wilcox stared at the destruction, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. He had seen it, felt it, fought it. It wasn't a dream, not a feverish hallucination, not a trick of his delicate nerves. It had been real, tangible, a breach in the veil of reality. And his art had been the gateway, the dreadful key. A strange, cold calm began to settle over him, an unnatural serenity born of utter exhaustion and shattered sanity. The fever was gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute lucidity that was far more terrifying than any delirium. He understood everything now. The dreams, the carvings, the entities, the great slumbering horror in the depths of cosmic time. They were real, and they were waiting. He looked at his hands, artist's hands, now caked in mud and grime, trembling no longer. They had created the portal, and they had destroyed it. But the knowledge, the hideous, unbearable truth of cosmic reality remained etched into his very soul, a permanent, grotesque brand. He was irrevocably changed, tainted by the glimpse behind the veil, a man now intimately acquainted with the void. The sun was rising, casting weak grey light through the studio window, painting the ravaged room in the dull colours of a new, desolate day. Wilcox felt no relief, only a profound, crushing weariness that penetrated to his very bones. He knew that the destruction of the bas-relief was only a temporary reprieve. He had seen the entities in his dreams, their eager, hateful faces, their alien hunger. They knew him now. They knew of this world. and they would find another way, another artist, another sensitive soul, another means to cross. He stood there, motionless, amidst the ruined clay, a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure, his mind a wasteland where sanity had once bloomed. The silence of the studio was broken only by the distant, mundane sounds of Providence stirring to life, oblivious to the cosmic horror that had almost breached its reality, to the ancient evil that had almost claimed one of its own. Henry Anthony Wilcox, the sensitive artist, had glimpsed the true face of the universe, and his soul had been irrevocably scarred, his spirit broken. He would never sculpt again, for he understood now that his art was not merely representation. It was a doorway, and he had learned, in the most terrifying way imaginable, that some doors are best left closed. The nightmares had receded for now, but he knew they lingered, vast and ancient, awaiting their next opportunity. And he, Henry Anthony Wilcox, would forever be listening, his mind irrevocably attuned to the terrible, persistent call from beyond.